hearing will please come to order. The chair recognizes Chairman Hamilton.
The chair recognizes Mr. McCollum for 10 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. I used to have the privilege of calling you that before you went down to the White House to wear another hat when you did appear up here a lot in front of our banking committee as Secretary of the Treasury. And it's good to see you in the seat again, even though I know this is not the most comfortable occasion for you to be with us. We are going to certainly wrap up this expeditiously this morning. I think you've given us yesterday pretty much a full rundown of what you do know. And I just have one or two remaining points that I would like to raise with you to try to satisfy some of my curiosity and the public's, I think. Yesterday you related to us, I believe I'm correct, that you tried to have breakfast with Admiral Poindexter about once a week when he was possible and he was around. And is this generally true? I mean, was that my recollection correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And I assume that you would discuss various issues at that point in time with him, whether they be procedural or whatever happened to come up. That was the purpose of the meeting, just like the breakfast that you urged the Secretary of the State and Secretary of Defense and so on to have once a week.
Theirs was a luncheon, this was a breakfast, but you're right, that was the purpose of it.
What I think the American public is curious about is, in those breakfasts you had with Admiral Poindexter, why didn't you, or perhaps you did, ask him on occasion with regard to the Iranian initiatives that you generally were aware of? How are you going about this? Give me some of the details. That's the kind of question that I'm wondering if you did ask, or if you didn't, why you didn't.
Fair question. Generally at those breakfasts we talked more about housekeeping details, trips that the President might be making, forthcoming international events, and how to get ready for it. It took a lot of administrative work, for example, for an economic summit, meeting with the General Secretary, something of that nature. So, by and large, we didn't get into questions of the nature that you just described. Very frankly, as I think I said yesterday in testimony, after about February of 1986 until October, with the exception of May of '86, I really didn't focus on the Iranian situation at all. I was busy on a lot of other things and felt that the National Security Advisor was playing his role in this. He had charge of it, and so I let him have his head, as it were.
Well, there's a lot of 40-40 hindsight that goes on, especially with this committee, and I'm sure there's going to be some 40-40 hindsighting saying that you should have looked at that a little bit more, or you should have asked him about it, but I'm not going to plug into that today. I think that can be rehashed. The commentators can do that, and others can do that. But I'm concerned about a broader policy question than simply your knowledge or your asking about those questions of Admiral Poindexter. At one point during the hearings, Colonel North, in his testimony, told us that he thought it would have been far preferable to have had a confrontation with Congress over the Boland Amendment than to have had the kind of policies that he was carrying out in the covert resupply and in the fundraising activities in the manner in which they were going. I don't know for sure if he meant a constitutional confrontation, although that certainly would have been my preference if I'd been there talking about it, or if he meant another form of it. But I asked that question, as I had to Mr. McFarland, to Admiral Poindexter, because I was the one who had originally raised that issue, and Colonel North referred to it. I said, wouldn't it have been better to have had such a confrontation over Boland in the beginning, instead of getting involved in a secret policy with regard to this? And he said, yes. In fact, that was my position all along, but I was overruled, or words to that effect. What are your views about the confrontation issue, and do you recall it ever coming up in any of the discussions?
I recall it coming up in conjunction with the continuing resolution in 1985. I believe Boland came in, there was a Boland amendment to that CR. If I'm correct in that, I know that part of our discussion was, what do we do about this? The CR in 1985, maybe I have it mistaken with the 86, but I think it was the 85 one, was about 2 weeks late. The fiscal year had started October 1st, and we were still without budgets for most of our departments. We had worked long and hard with the Congress, hadn't got all that we wanted, neither did the Congress get all that it wanted, but we had successfully arrived at a compromise for that CR. At that point in time, it was more of a tactical decision, I would think, than a real strategic political decision. Do we take on the Congress over the Boland Amendment or don't we? And it was felt that after looking at it, well, we can live with it. We don't like it. We can live with it. We'll try to change it with the Congress next year. This is mid-October. We'll start working on it in mid-January. Let's go along with it. There was another alternative strategy that was offered to us, and that is, no, bring the government down, grind it to a halt, refuse to accept the CR, veto it, and have a constitutional, not a constitutional, but have a legislative fight over it.
Well, what about after the fact? You know, even though you accepted it, it was part of this big appropriations bill, which would have caused a problem to veto and to get into the bringing the government down or shutting it down for a while. Even after it was law, couldn't the President have confronted, and I think that's what Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North were saying, confronted Congress in the sense of openly saying, at least as far as his National Security Council and those that weren't covered by it technically in the view of those who have given us that view, we're going to go ahead and do this. The President's going to publicly fundraise for the Contras, which I know was a proposal that went up in one of the memoranda. The President and his key staff people are going to do everything they can to keep the Contras alive. I think that was the President's policy. But it wasn't presented in a confrontational way to make an issue out of it politically or publicly. And I think that's what they're talking about, a way that might have wound up in the courts.
Well, again, you have a question here of decision. There were many congressional leaders, particularly in our own party, who were counseling the President against this confrontational policy with the Congress, that relationships had soured enough.
Were you one of those?
You will recall that I was one of the ones that the Congress was saying was one of the ones that was causing this souring of relationships because of the confrontation. No, I wasn't one that was for sweet and amiable relationships with the Congress, which meant let the Congress have its own way and you have a weak chief executive. No, I was the other side, saying the chief executive should stand up for what he wanted. But you can only fight a battle on so many fronts at once. And the decision made, right or wrong, was that this wasn't one of the issues that we were really going to take on and go to the mat.
I'd like to look at this picture of what we've seen in the committee for the last few weeks with you in a somewhat of an overview, because I think some themes are emerging. That confrontation concerns me, and that's one of them, but there are a number of things that are. We've learned out of the past few weeks, and I think pleases me, and I'm sure it does you a great deal, that the President's credibility issue has been resolved in his favor. I don't think there's any question out of these hearings that the public now understands that all along the President has been truthful. There have been problems, there have been a lot of issues raised, and there may be judgment question calls involved in this, but that issue has been cleared up. But I think some other troubling things have been raised. The most troubling to me is the lack of trust issue on intelligence matters. It seems to have been a chief motivating factor with regard to some of the people, the key players in this, in not informing Congress and in not talking to each other. A concern over leaks of sensitive intelligence information. And we've also had, and I think you testified to some of this yesterday in your opinion, some suggestions that have been made along the way that we might do to remedy that lack of trust. One of them would be a smaller joint intelligence committee to oversight that function. One of them might be to have the group of 8 more clearly legislatively defined and under given tight time limits require reporting to that group. One of them, I think, would be to strengthen and revise our laws, criminal laws on leaks in a bill such as one I introduced yesterday in H.R. 3066 that some of the members of this committee co-sponsored. All of those, I think, you would have to agree are things that we ought to look at when we get to our recommendation area to try to rebuild that lack of trust. But it seems to me there are also some other things that we need to do that haven't been done, and I'm not sure how many of those can be done legislatively. We need to get our operational resources in the anti-terrorism area back on track. I see a weakness, perhaps being close to it you didn't see, but I see a strong weakness in the area of our willingness or perhaps our confidence in our special operations teams or our CIA intelligence to go out and rescue hostages or to take preemptive steps that are necessary. We've done a great job with Libya and a few of those types, but getting back individual hostages has been a terrible ordeal for everybody. It was true for Carter, it's true for Reagan, it's going to be true for the next president. One of the things that's lacking is not legislative. We passed a law here for a new Assistant Secretary of Defense, and since you've left the White House, you may not be aware, but we still haven't filled that post, and it's an ongoing problem that certainly Secretary Weinberger will have to address later today or tomorrow or Monday or whenever. And then last but not least is this issue of confrontation. I don't think we can legislate in that area, but it seems to me that the terrible problem we've got here is going to have to be resolved in some way down the road between the legislative and the executive branches regarding who has the strength in the foreign policy area and some of what have been very gray areas in the past and maybe didn't need to be refined more. But now, in this time, when we have these problems that are facing us, like the hostages and the terrorism and so on, we have an obligation to define that and refine it more. And it seems to me it's going to require a stronger stance by the President, making a role in confronting Congress occasionally, as was not done here. And maybe, again, it's 40-40 hindsight, but I'm looking ahead. We can look back and learn. I'm not criticizing, just saying, hey, when we have another Boland, we need to have more confrontation to refine this issue if we ever come forward and can get this resolved. Does that summary strike you as a fair approximation of some of the key things that this committee needs to address in looking at recommendations and resolving what we've been looking at all these weeks?
I'd say it's a fair summary. There are many points that you raised I'd like to discuss more with you at the appropriate time.
Certainly.
Because some of them do require more explanation. But nonetheless, I think there are these issues which I hope this committee will address in its final summary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr. Stokes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Regan.
Mr. Stokes.
Mr. Regan, I'd like to begin my questions by referring back to the conversation you had on November 24th with Director Casey. I know a couple of my colleagues have already made some reference to that conversation, but I'd like to approach it in just a little different way. I do so for the reason that we have received some rather contradictory testimony regarding the involvement of Mr. Casey and around the whole question of diversion. And let me just tell you what the contradictions are as I see them. Colonel North told our committee that Mr. Casey knew of the diversion and that he concocted the Fall Guy plan. Admiral Poindexter testified that he told North to tell no one about the diversion and that he assumed that North had obeyed him. He later found out that North told McFarland in July of 1986. Then he found out that Director Casey knew from North's testimony before our committee. Admiral Poindexter told Attorney General Meese that no one in the White House but himself and North knew of the diversion. Director Casey told Attorney General Meese that he did not know of the diversion. Colonel North told Attorney General Meese that only Poindexter and McFarland in the United States government knew of the diversion. I would ask you, and I think that your opinion would be valuable to us in terms of trying to, in some manner, reconcile these contradictions. Going back to the conversation you had with Director Casey that day, and giving consideration to what you've already told us in terms of the fact that his expression was rather benign and consequently you couldn't derive much from that. But knowing everything that you now know and putting the conversation you had with Director Casey in the same category you did with the President when you said you knew the President was an actor, but that you were totally convinced that knowledge of the diversion was completely new to him. And so my question is, putting everything into context retrospectively, given your impression from that conversation you had that day, would you say that, in your opinion, that this was the first time that Director Casey had knowledge of the diversion?
That's a very difficult question for me to answer. As I said yesterday, he did not indicate to me that he did know of the diversion. On the other hand, He didn't say that he did not know of it. It seems to me that you gentlemen will have to look a little bit more into some of the stories that I have read someplace. I have no personal knowledge of this, about this Canadian group that somehow or other were loaning money to carry on the transactions, and they're not getting their amount of money. This was told to Casey, as I recall from what I read, in October, and then he raised that question with Poindexter and others about this money. Whether or not at that point he could have learned of the diversion, I don't know, but it would seem to me that if he were that involved to where he had a story from a third party, that as head of the CIA, he would have run it down a little bit more. I don't know.
Sure. Well, I appreciate your testimony on that point. I think it'll be helpful to us in trying to reconcile these differences. Mr. Regan, during the period of time you were the Chief of Staff, after Poindexter and North had left the White House, did there come a time when there was a discussion with the President, when you were present, about congressional immunity for Colonel North and Admiral Poindexter?
Yes, there was such a time.
Okay. And would that have been around approximately December 15th, 16th?
I think even earlier than that, probably around December 8th, 9th, or 10th, in through there.
I see.
I recall discussions of that.
And who was present at that time?
Well, I remember one discussions among the President, the Vice President, and myself regarding this as to how to get the full story out. Both the Admiral and the Colonel were refusing to talk. We had said we didn't know the story, couldn't find out the story. Granted, the Tower Commission was working, but still in an effort to hasten this, I believe the President did suggest publicly sometime in the period to which I referred that either the Senate or the House or both intelligence committees should give limited immunity to both of these witnesses or to either one of them in order to get a story out. But both of the committees, the House and the Senate Intelligence Committees, said no, they didn't want to do that. That it wasn't the proper time.
Okay. Now, at either that particular meeting or any other meetings, was a question of presidential pardon for either Admiral Poindexter or Colonel North ever discussed with the President?
Yes, it was.
Can you tell us when that was?
Yeah, somebody brought it up to him, got shot down right away. That was something the President wouldn't even listen to, the fact that he should grant a pardon. His reasoning went along this sort of line. To grant a pardon means you think somebody has committed a crime. You only pardon for a crime. And he didn't know what the crime was. As yet, there had been no evidence brought to him. The Tower Commission report was not out. The independent counsel had been put in being, but he had no report. Obviously, neither the Senate nor the House Intelligence Committees had finished, let alone the fact that this committee would be set up. So the President said, not only is it premature, but I'll be darned if I'm going to accuse them of a crime in advance.
Was that the extent of the conversation that
Yeah,
day?
it never came up again. I mean, he put his foot down hard, and it never came up again.
Okay. Now, you testified yesterday that, to your knowledge, the President did not know that the CIA was involved in the November 1985 Hawk shipment. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Now, if he did not know, do you believe that he would have or should have signed a finding retroactively approving something he did not know anything about at the time?
Well, as I said, I still am a little bit imprecise about that finding. A, that there was a finding. B, that he signed it. There is no such document. There is a draft document, I know, but I've never seen the final document with his signature on it. And I'm unable to state whether he should have done it retroactively or not. You know, the curious thing about that, Mr. Stokes, is that we had quite a conversation on December 7th in the quarters among the leading players in this affair, and there was discussion of a finding and operating under a finding, and yet no one at that meeting brought up the subject that the President had already signed the finding. And I find that very curious, that I've racked my brain about it. I've read the testimony of witnesses before this committee who participated in that meeting, and as yet nobody has said that anybody said, whether it was Poindexter, McFarland, or anybody who would have known of the President signing that, would have said, hey, we already got a finding.
I think some of us find that that testimony rather curious also.
I'm at a loss on that one.
Finally, let me just offer an addendum to the colloquy you had yesterday with Mr. Hyde with reference to the precedent established in terms of chiefs of staff testifying before the Congress, and I think your recollection was that Sherman Adams was the only exception that you...
May I correct something? We got a phone call at my office saying Mr. Haldeman had also testified.
That is correct. When you said it yesterday, it struck me, and I had an opportunity to check it last night. And
well, that shows, you know, if you got a good staff.
That's right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to refer back to a series of statements and a press conference question and clear up what may be an ambiguity. Yesterday, Senator Cohen, in his questions to you, had referred to a statement that the President had made to Mr. McFarland expressing the displeasure that the Israelis had gone ahead with an arms shipment prior to any approval by the United States. And he asked them to convey that to the Israelis, and your response to the question that he'd asked was, yes, that indeed was correct. John Poindexter said that in the meeting on November 10th, he reported in that meeting that the Israelis went ahead without our prior approval. That also was covered by Senator Cohen's question. And I think yesterday Mr. Smiljanich also asked a question about that, and your response was affirmative, that the President did not know prior to the shipment of tow missiles that Israel intended to do so. That's on page 30 of your testimony yesterday. So we have several different markers down that I think at one time you said it in, if I recall correctly, at the August 6th meeting, the President had expressed concern about the Israeli shipment of arms. So we have several different markers about that. And yet on the President's press conference on November 19th, if you care to refer to it, that's exhibit number 48. Page 1587 of that presidential document, the question was asked this way by Andrea Mitchell. Mr. President, to follow up on that, we've been told by the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, that this government condoned an Israeli shipment in September of 1985. And that would appear that this recitation is contrary to testimony of yourself, of John Poindexter, and references to Mr. McFarland's testimony, all differing from the background which she stated in her question to the President on November 19th. Can you help us clear that up?
I hope so, Senator. The use of the word condoned, I take it to mean exactly what I testified to yesterday. That is, the Israelis did it without our knowledge, but once they had done it, we did not then go back and make them undo it or in any way condemn them for it. And by the fact that we didn't protest, except privately, from McFarland to his contacts, whoever that might have been, we didn't make a big deal out of it or a big case out of it. And I think that's why the use of the word condone.
It did not intend to imply that we had given prior approval.
No. And you will recall that later we did refurbish their supply.
Well, again, referring to your testimony yesterday on page 30, when Mr. Smiljanich was asking the questions, Mr. Smiljanich said, what was said at that meeting in September of 1985 about the replenishment of the missiles that Israel had shipped to Iran? And your answer was, and I quote, "The President was quite upset that his hand was being forced in this way. He still wasn't certain because he had told McFarland in the August 6th meeting to go slow on this and let's make sure we know who we are dealing with before we get too far into this. As a result, to have his hand forced that way was quite upsetting. And he said, as far as any replenishment is concerned, we will cross that bridge later. I'm not quite going to do anything about that now."
That's correct.
And the President was upset?
Oh, yes, he was very upset.
And what do you mean by the Israelis having forced his hand that way?
Well, they had gone ahead and made an initial transaction in this channel and were drawing the United States government into it because they shipped these arms. Weir came out. The deed was already done, and we really hadn't had time to put this whole matter before an NSPG or what have you and go over it in any detail. They did it for us without our knowledge in advance.
And we did later agree to the replenishment.
Oh, yes.
But there's one other little fact that ties in with that might help us if we get it into some kind of perspective, and that is later on when the Israelis were trying again to get us to go forward with this project, they offered, even though we had agreed to the replenishment, they said, go ahead, if it doesn't work, we'll even give up on the replenishment of the 500 tows, the initial shipment, which would indicate to me that maybe they hadn't really expected to get replenishment.
I can't offer any additional information on that. I don't know.
At the beginning, they had no approval?
As far as I know, they had no approval and no assurances that if they did it, it would be replaced.
And even after there was an agreement for replenishment, they offered to go ahead without replenishment?
That's a fact I learned later. I didn't know that at the time.
Let me refer you to exhibit number 41A, if you will, for a moment. At page 10 of exhibit 41A, which is I think your notes of the meeting on November 10th. I refer you to what Secretary Schultz said, and I'll just read from your notes on that page. And this is referring to what Secretary Schultz said at that meeting. Thinks Israelis suckered us into this so we can't complain of their sales. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes, I do.
And what was it he said? Is that all of what he said?
That's my interpretation. I don't think the Secretary actually used those words, but I at times talk and take notes in the vernacular. His point was that since the Israelis were so close to us in this deal, and they, in point of fact, were already shipping arms to Iran, we could not consistently agree in private with them to be a participant in that and then publicly condemn any arms shipments they might be sending to Iran. I don't think it's a top secret that the Israelis seem to, in one type of deal or another, to favor Iran over Iraq in that current conflict.
Well, you were careful to say you're not sure those were his words, but I refer you back to exhibit number 41, which is Al Keel's notes of the same meeting.
Did he use the same
and
words?
he uses precisely the same words.
Then I think the secretary must have said it if two of us recorded it that way.
You're an accurate reporter.
Better than I thought.
Do you recall in discussions that you had or in which you participated, who set the price for the missiles sold to Iran?
Price was never discussed in front of me. I never knew the cost of a tow, 500 tows, 1,000 tows, nor did I ever hear anyone talk about the cost of spare parts.
Now, you indicated, I think, in some testimony yesterday that you were really a little concerned about the fact that large profits had been made. And yet, if I recall the testimony, it was Mr. Ghorbanifar who first said what the Iranians would be willing to pay, and the Israelis who had first charged that price, and the Israelis who had first diverted money from the sale to other purposes. That was in their sale, not ours. Were you aware of those facts?
I have no knowledge of that at all.
If you had been aware of those facts, and if indeed they are facts, and I believe that there is record before us that they are, but there may not be conclusive evidence, but if those were facts, the Israelis took the price that was established by Mr. Ghorbanifar as the price the Iranians would be willing to pay, had charged that price, and a little bit more as a matter of fact, and had then diverted the proceeds to other uses, would that have made the rest of the pattern that evolved over the next several months look more predictable or less understandable?
Well, I think had we known that at the time, we would have blown a whistle right away because, you know, what is this? What's going on here? How come we have people making a profit in here on this deal? This was not supposed to be that type of deal. I think we'd have looked at it a little more closely. Now, granted, again, I'm sitting here a year or more after the fact, looking at it through a different pair of eyes. But any time that something of this nature has ever come up involving money, I've always been very cautious. I want to know who's getting paid for what. And if there's somebody making a profit on it, let's be careful.
Mr. Chairman, I see my time is up, but Mr. Regan, let me compliment you for your testimony. It's been very helpful to the committee. I think it's has filled in some gaps and corroborated some details. It's been very useful to us. If I might, Mr. Chairman, just in closing, I noted that yesterday that Congressman Hyde had said, we're sitting in judgment on the executive. That in part is true, but I think in a much larger sense, the Congress is also being judged by the American people. So I don't think it's just the executive that is being judged. I think we are too. Thank you very much.
Mr. Boland, 10 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Regan.
Good morning, Mr. Boland.
I'm interested in the tone and the substance of the discussion that must have taken place among the President, the Vice President, the Attorney General, and you in the Oval Office on the morning of Tuesday, November 25th, 1986. This would have been prior to the meeting scheduled with Admiral Poindexter, who was to join that meeting perhaps an hour or a half hour after the first meeting. Did the Attorney General provide any summary on his inquiry, what he had uncovered, or what was left to do with respect to his inquiry? His inquiry started, as you know, on the 21st. Here you are meeting on the 25th, and I was wondering whether or not the Attorney General gave you any summary of that inquiry at that meeting.
Well, he went over again, perhaps in more detail, what he had told the President and me the previous afternoon about the diversion of funds. I think he was repeating it to make sure that the Vice President was fully filled in, had the same amount of knowledge as the President himself, although he had talked to the Vice President on Monday afternoon also. Then we went into matters of procedure. Where do we go from here? We were talking about having leaders of Congress down. They were questioning me as to had we notified the various leaders we wished to speak to and could they come. Then we went on to discuss the press conference and the mechanics of how that would be handled in revealing this. And then we got into a matter of discussing the commission and how that would be set up. And I was explaining more in detail my thoughts of the smaller three-man committee rather than a 17-member committee and the like. So we consumed a half hour pretty quickly that way, and then it was time for Poindexter to come in.
You had already discussed with or advised Admiral Poindexter to resign, had you not?
That's correct.
And there was a discussion, I take it, in that meeting of that incident among the four of you?
Not very much discussion. I told the others that I had, how will I put it, made a suggestion to Poindexter that he have his resignation with him when he came in, and I told the President that I anticipated he would, so the President could expect it and be prepared for it.
Did anyone suggest that since Admiral Poindexter would be joining the meeting within probably a few minutes, some additional questions might profitably be asked about the operation of the diversion plan?
No, because you will recall that at that point in time, two of us, both the Attorney General and I, had been told by Admiral Poindexter that if this was more or less a failure to supervise rather than his having any knowledge of the diversion.
Was there any discussion of bringing Colonel North to the meeting so that questions might be asked of him?
No, sir.
As I noted yesterday that you indicated that perhaps there was someone in the NSC who was familiar and deeply involved in the technical details of the diversion. Would that have been Colonel North?
Yes.
Now, in your testimony yesterday, Senator Mitchell, in response to a question by Senator Mitchell, you gave an opinion as to Admiral Poindexter's credibility. I want to ask you another question in that area because it has been widely reported that some in the administration, for instance, Larry Speaks, when he was the President's spokesman, felt that the Admiral had been, on occasions, less than forthcoming with him and others. Did you believe, while you were Chief of Staff, that the Admiral ever misled you?
Apart from this Iran-Contra, which in retrospect I think he did mislead me, I know of no other instances. I have to explain something to you regarding Mr. Speaks's remarks. There were times when the Admiral had to be very careful because he was dealing with sensitive foreign policy affairs or with ongoing affairs involving intelligence gathering. And he had to be extremely careful of how much he told to Speaks, because whatever he told to Speaks, naturally Speaks was authorized to give to the press. And there are many times when, for those reasons, you want to not tell everything that you know or how you got to know it.
In your deposition, you indicated that you learned of the existence of the NSC chronology on November 19th, 1986. You asked for a copy of it on the 20th, and it was provided by Admiral Poindexter to you on the 21st. Later that day, on the 21st, Admiral Poindexter asks that the chronology be returned for revision, and you did not comply. Why?
First of all, I had turned it over to the President's counsel and told him to take a close look at it. He gave it a cursory going over, and when I got back from some other meeting I had attended, he said to me, "This doesn't hang together, Don, be careful." I said, "Well, you hang on to that and check it out." So when Poindexter asked, I did dissemble with him. I said, I can't find it right now, John. I'll get it to you at an appropriate time. Let time expire, and I went home without giving it to him.
So I take it that you were not concerned that changes might have been made to conceal the facts if you returned it to him?
Well, what I didn't know is I knew something was wrong, but what I didn't know. And that's what I was trying to find out. And I was afraid if I let the document go back again, I wouldn't be able to see all the facts on several pages.
Mr. Regan, you took pride in your efforts to put the best light on events that some might have otherwise interpreted as being adverse to the administration's interest. To do that successfully, I assume that you had to be in full possession of all the facts so that you could determine which would be most helpful in making the administration's case. When you learned of the diversion, why didn't you go to North and Poindexter and ask for a full account of the facts so that you would know how far the damage might go?
Several reasons.
Let me ask, one of the reasons I
ahead.
asked that is because I'm looking at a statement that you made to the Washington Post on February 28th of 1987. I'm quoting, "Some of us are like a shovel brigade that follows a parade down Main Street
I was wondering
cleaning
when that
up."
would be brought up.
And
Almost got away from it.
you also indicated that if you're going to put a spin on something, you have to have all the facts to know which way to spin it. Why didn't you ask Colonel North or Admiral Poindexter for all of the information with respect to the diversion?
Well, my reasoning at that time was that there was a criminal investigation underway. For me to put myself into that, I thought was inappropriate. Secondly, we had nominated a commission, an independent commission, to look into all of these facts and to gather the facts. Accordingly, for me to sit there as interrogator questioning these people didn't seem appropriate, so I didn't. I didn't feel that was, the thing to do when the president had set up two other avenues and there was the possibility of an independent counsel.
There was some indication in an editorial I read today that you had the keys of the palace. You were not the only one that had the keys of the palace, were you? I take it that the National Security Advisor had the keys of the palace too, because he didn't have to go around you to get into His Majesty's room, did he?
Depends upon what you mean by the keys to the palace. I've seen
That's access to the presidency.
reports in the press today about the fact that I wasn't what I seemed to have been and all that type of stuff. Again, I repeat what I tried to make clear yesterday, although some people find it hard to imagine it, and that is that there are really two staffs in the White House. There is that national security staff, which services the National Security Council, comes under the National Security Advisor. It does not and has never, except in the person of Richard Allen for 1 year, reported to the President through anybody. It didn't in previous administrations. The National Security Council is a separate organization. I did and was Chief of Staff of the White House staff running the West Wing. That's what I tried to do. So as far as access to the President is concerned, yes, I controlled access to the President, but as I testified yesterday, there were 5 people who had freedom to go in and out of the Oval Office as they needed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Regan. Thank you.
Senator Nunn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, we were talking yesterday about your notes, and I refer you to your notes of the November 10th meeting, which I believe is Exhibit 41A. If you would take a look at that, and it's page 13. Have you got that page 13 there?
I do.
Sir, if you could look down at the bottom of that page, PRES is the President, is that right?
That's correct.
Could you just walk us through those last 3 or 4 entries down there, telling us what you mean by those notes, where it says George and the President, George and the President?
George, referring to Secretary Schultz, is talking here about how do we handle the matter from a public point of view. And what the President is saying, that what he should say in public is that he supports the present policy. All of us should say that. Our policy, quite obviously, as I explained yesterday, with the 4 points. 1, contact with Iran because of its geographical and geopolitical importance. 2, the question of making certain that it was neutral, if not anti-Soviet. 3, that to get the Iranians to use their good graces to reduce terrorism. And 4, to see what they could do, if anything, about contacting the kidnappers to get our hostages back. That was the President's policy. But he noticed the President says, say nothing else, because there's danger to the hostages. In other words, don't go on and speculate, stick to that.
Okay, that takes us down to the next sentence, and I'm really interested in the last 2 or 3 sentences. If you could just tell us what George said there, what the President said there, and what they meant by that. If you could perhaps read those last couple of entries, what they meant by.
There's a misspelling here. I think that's what's happened. I'm not such a great note taker. George says, I will support and have always supported the Iranian long-range policy of contact with Iran. And then he says, I have never supported, there's no support. I spelled no, K-N-O-W. I should have spelled it N-O. Right. No support for weapons for hostages. That is Schultz defending or explaining or restating what was well known to us, that he did not support that policy.
So that's entirely consistent with his other statements?
That is correct.
All right, now how about that last entry there? Is that the President?
The President again.
Could you just read that and then tell us what it means?
The side with military superiority will win. We want to have things even. This helps Iran, which was the weaker of the 2 sides. In other words, in the Iran-Iraq war, our policy was, as far as I know still is, that war should end in a stalemate, neither side being a winner. Try to get it to a halt. But if one side has military superiority over the other side, obviously it's going to win.
Well, my problem with that is that the wrong side was the one the President used there. That was not the position of our government. Our government's position, and I went over this with Secretary Schultz, was that the Iraqi side was deteriorating and that the Iranian side had the long-range advantage. And this is November the 10th. This is just 4 or 5 months ago, or at least 6, 7 months ago. And this is November the 10th, 1986, where you have the President of the United States saying that he believes the Iranian side is losing. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did anybody correct him in that meeting?
No, because Schultz immediately picked up that he wanted things kept in channels. That is, the State Department should be running the Iran endeavor, and it shouldn't be run out of the NSC.
We had Secretary Weinberger at that meeting, is that right?
I believe so.
Secretary Schultz was at that meeting?
Yes, he was.
You had the Vice President at that meeting?
He was.
Director Casey at that meeting?
Yes.
I believe you were at that meeting. Of course,
Yes.
These were your notes, obviously. Admiral Poindexter was at that meeting.
Yes.
And here you have the President of the United States giving what is essentially erroneous policy, a policy statement. It wasn't a small detail. It was a question of who our government believed was winning that war. And he was stating what Secretary of State has testified before this committee was not the policy of the United States, and what we have classified reports from the whole community, including intelligence, including defense, including state, saying exactly the opposite of this. And the President makes this statement, which is obviously fundamentally conflicting with the policy of our supposed policy of our government, and nobody corrects him. Is that what happened?
As far as I know, my notes don't reflect anyone having corrected him. If indeed that was the fact, I don't know that that was the fact.
Well, if I'm correct, that the policy of the United States government then was that the Iraqis had the long-term problem and that their position was deteriorating, don't you find it alarming that the President could be under a total misinterpretation of what the U.S. government believed about that war?
Well, there's a lot of this that's classified information. I'm not sure I want to discuss it in this meeting, Mr. Chairman. But I would take issue with some of the things you've just said, but only from a classified point of view.
Were you under the impression that the Iranians were deteriorating and losing the war?
I have a problem here, Mr. Chairman. This is very sensitive classified material that we're discussing here in public.
I've been given, Mr. Chairman, I've checked with the State Department very carefully on this, and I know exactly what's classified and I know what's not. I won't push Mr. Regan on this, but it is not classified. That the United States government position at that time was that we felt the Iraqi position was deteriorating. That's not classified. I found this very, very disturbing, that we could have this kind of fundamental misunderstanding by the President on an issue this key, and obviously very much in his mind, and obviously very much of the policy. I just suggest to you, Mr. Regan, that that was November 10th, 1986, and 4 or 5 months later we were basically agreeing to flag Kuwaiti vessels, which is a tilt towards Iraq. And here the President is on November the 10th, 1986, saying we had to help the Iranians because the sides weren't even.
Well, that's trying to keep things even-handed, Senator. You see, we can't help one side or the other. If we give help to one, we've got to give help to the other.
Flagging vessels, shipping arms, is that a balanced foreign policy?
As I explained to you, we want neither side to win. You can't help just one side.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Mr. Regan, if you have any sensitive information which you feel will clarify the situation, we'll be very happy to arrange to receive it in a secure condition.
I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that rather than I, who am not an expert in this, that you might consider the next witness, Secretary Weinberger, be alerted to this question, and maybe he would want to discuss it with you as to exactly what the intelligence we were being furnished at that time was.
Your suggestion is very valid, sir. We'll do so. Thank you.
Mr. DeWine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Regan.
Morning.
One of the things that I think has been very clear in this investigation is that the President did not get all the facts, and that's part of the problem, or maybe it's the #1 problem. I think also that we could all agree that one of the main jobs of a Chief of Staff is to make sure that the flow of information goes to the President, that nothing impedes that. He gets the basic facts that he needs so that he is the one who ultimately makes the decisions. I wonder if you could just maybe, based upon your experience in this case, based upon your experience as Chief of Staff, White House Chief of Staff, give us a little advice and maybe give advice to future Chiefs of Staff and future Presidents. What can be done, or can it be done by a Chief of Staff to ensure that Presidents get the basic information that they need, so that the information flows to them?
Well, except in this instance where there was apparently a deliberate effort to conceal things from the President, I know of no time during the 2 years that I served as Chief of Staff where there weren't basic facts given to the President. Now, at times these were imprecise, they weren't filled, particularly when there's an ongoing situation. Plane is taken hostage. You're not sure of what's going on. There are fragmentary reports. Obviously, you can't give him all of the information. But on the domestic side, if he's trying to make a decision that might involve, let's say, the EPA, or might involve some aspect of the budget or something of that nature, there is plenty of information given to the President, comes up through the Cabinet Council system, so that he does have enough information on which to make a decision. Quite obviously, if ever again there were a situation in which a President does not get all the information because members of his staff conceal it from him, then he's at a real disadvantage.
So, and I've got another question. I do want to move on, but in summary, you don't see any structural change that you would recommend to a president or to a chief of staff to avoid a situation that you have described where the president's one of his chief advisors, the NSC advisor, withholds information. Except from the suggestion I made yesterday that the President's counsel be brought into any covert operation before it starts, before a decision is made as to whether we should go into one or not. And also... President's legal counsel. Yeah, the President's legal counsel. And also that the paperwork flow in the White House, particularly where it involves sensitive, highly classified material, be restructured so that that has to flow from A to B to C, so that we're sure we know under what circumstances the President is getting it, how he's getting it, and what he does with it. Well, let me follow up with that, if I could, about a specific question about the legal counsel. It's my understanding in November of 1986, Mr. Wallison was the White House counsel. Is that true? November of '86? Yes. Yes, he was. And what that means is that he's the President's lawyer. That's right. Not? In fact, the President is his only client. That's right. Well, he has other responsibilities. But the President's his principal client. His principal client, yes. If I could, I'd like to read to you from the deposition we took of Charles Cooper, who, of course, is the Assistant Attorney General, was the Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. This deposition was taken on June 23rd, 1987. I have a copy here, but and I'll give it to you, but if I could just read it to you, it might expedite things. Let me just set the stage, Mr. Regan, if I could. Mr. Cooper is being asked at the meeting, at this deposition about the meeting in Poindexter's office that was called to go over Director Casey's testimony on November 20th, 1986. Let me read now from the deposition. Question, Mr. Wallison and his office was not represented, as you have testified. Answer, right. Question, did you think it was odd that he wasn't there at that point? Answer, at that point? Question, especially after the meeting 2 days before. Now, the meeting, of course, 2 days before was when Wallison had called all his counterparts together to basically complain, at least that's my understanding, about the fact that he was being cut out. You had the chief counsels of Justice, State, DOD, CIA, and NSC, and he was complaining those 2 days before about being cut out from the process. Answer, yes. By that time, I was beginning to sense and certainly appreciate the fact that Peter Wallison was not a participant in this, did not seem to be at all included in this matter generally. Question, was he basically being frozen out of this situation? Answer, I certainly understood that to be his view of it. Well, was it your view? Answer, it is obvious that he wasn't involved, so presumably conscious decisions were made not to involve him. Question, did you think it odd that there was no one there representing Don Regan, his staff? Answer, not particularly, and I really can't say it was odd that Wallison wasn't at this meeting, but I do think it was odd that he wasn't at any meeting other than the ones that he called to find out what was going on. It was quite clear that there was some kind of fissure between the NSC and Peter Wallison of the White House counsel. End of deposition, end of quote. Now, Mr. Regan, did Peter Walson express to you his feeling that he was being frozen out?
Yes, he did, on several occasions.
And after he expressed this to you, President's own lawyer saying, I'm being cut out of this, what did you do to try to get him back in the ballgame? What did you do to try to get him involved so that the President would have the benefit of his own legal counsel in a very, very crucial time?
I asked Poindexter to include him in whatever meetings he was having. He refused to do it. He said that he had plenty of counsel. He had Paul Thompson on his own staff, and he had opinions from the Attorney General regarding what he was doing. So he felt that from a legal point of view, they had sufficient counsel. And he went on to say that their problem was not with the law. Their problem was in getting the facts themselves and the chronology straight. It was not whether or not they were doing things legally or illegally.
Mr. Regan, you have been a chief officer of Merrill Lynch. You were a strong CEO there. You were a strong cabinet officer, and contrary to the Washington Post this morning, I still think you were a strong chief of staff. Why, at that point, when you knew things were very crucial, didn't you go down, and if I could just use real blunt language, go down to Admiral Poindexter or over to his office and say, look, I don't care what you want, the President needs his lawyer. We've got to get him involved in this. This is a crucial time. Things are going wild. We've got to get somebody in here who can put this thing together, and the logical person is the President's lawyer.
At that point in time, the Attorney General got himself involved in it. And I felt that since the Attorney General was in there, and he was personally checking on the facts, that would be sufficient. We didn't have to have Wallison also at that point.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I would wholeheartedly agree with you. Once the Attorney General actually does get involved, that does the job, and in my opinion, it did do the job. But we've got a period of time prior to that, don't we, when this whole thing is breaking loose. From the time of the election day, November 4th, when the first article appears, you go to several meetings that you had, you go to the meeting that I was talking about. It's clear that you've got a vacuum, and a period of time that was a vacuum, and Wallison he's just out of it. I mean, the President's own lawyer is not involved in this thing. I admit it, once Ed Meese got involved, things got better, but before he got involved, shouldn't Wallison have been brought in hindsight, looking back?
Oh, in hindsight, definitely. But at that point in time, we didn't realize the significance of the legal problem that was involved here as to whether or not Boland had been observed or breached. We didn't had no idea of the diversion of funds and whether there was a possible criminal act here or not. We had no idea of that there was a tremendous legal problem involved.
But you were...
I'm talking about now between the 5th and, let's say, the 18th or 19th. Wallison did sit in on the briefings of the President for the, I believe he was there, in the briefings for the press conference.
Well, I appreciate your answer, and again, it's always easy for us to sit up here and criticize, and hindsight is as Bill McCollum says, 20/20. There's no doubt about that. I just think looking back, and maybe for future reference, that the President of the United States ought to have his legal counsel involved in decisions like this.
I agree with you completely on that, Mr. DeWine. As a matter of fact, I do hope that one of the outcomes of this, whether or not this committee recommends it, that the current Chief of Staff and the future Chiefs of Staff would see to it that whenever there's a covert action of any type, the President's counsel, in addition to whatever else is used, is brought into the discussions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hatch.
It's good to see you again. Nice to see you. Looking back on this entire series of events, I think we all can admit there's certainly a lot that can be criticized, and hopefully there are lessons that can be learned. And from what you've told us here yesterday and today, it appears to me that your instincts and your advice were basically sound. You get the facts, get them out. That's what you wanted to do. And I think that was a correct and a very proper approach. Now, looking back on it, and I ask this not in a critical way, but in the hope that we can perhaps learn from the past, do you think that maybe it was not a mistake to have taken another half day, even maybe a day, get more of the facts, and then it seems to me that the President, along with you and the Attorney General at his side, could have called on North, Poindexter, and Casey and received basically the whole story. So in retrospect, do you think that maybe the haste in calling a press conference was a mistake in the long run?
You would have to assume at that point that North and Poindexter would have told the full and complete and true story,
Sure.
even though they knew that perhaps they had done something wrong. I'm not sure, in view of what's happened, I don't want to impugn these two men because they always, as far as I was concerned, were honorable men. But it may be taking things a little bit too much for granted that they would have told the truth and nothing but the truth at that particular moment.
Okay, now I only have one or two other comments. I don't want to take all my time. You mentioned David Fisher in response to some questions posed by Representative Brooks, and I'm finding no fault with Congressman Brooks. He's a good friend, and he took his comments out of news accounts. Now, other than speculations by the press, do you have any evidence that Mr. Fisher was getting paid for arranging meetings at the White House for Mr. Channel's contributors or for anyone else?
No, I don't. As I said yesterday, Senator, I was shocked to read that.
Well, the fact of the matter is it isn't true, but let's go a little bit further. I just don't want the wrong impression left on this record, and I'm sure you would agree. Our committees have looked into this matter, and it is my clear understanding that Mr. Fisher had no contact with or even knowledge of Mr. Channel while Mr. Fisher was working at the White House as an employee. Then after he left the White House, he did enter into a retainer agreement with IBC. But that retainer was for Mr. Fisher's work as a political consultant with a large number of issues, most of which pertain to domestic matters, from what I understand. Mr. Fisher did that work, and as I understand it, he was paid for it. But it was never at any time paid specifically for arranging meetings at the White House, not $50,000 as the news accounts have mentioned and as Mr. Brooks' question indicated, or in any other sum. In fact, Mr. Channel already had a clear opening and a close working relationship with the White House long before he met Mr. Fisher. So I just don't want the wrong impression left here. I would think that you of all people would understand how allegations and false information in a few news stories can be very harmful and sometimes totally in error. I think we all understand that. And I know that happened to you. We've checked out Mr. Fisher thoroughly, and I know of no reason why he should be of any embarrassment to you or to the White House, as a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, I understand he was personally asked by the President to help make the arrangements for President Aquino's visit to the United States last year, which he did without compensation, and only on the condition that he be given none of the credit for it. And as I understand it, he gave up 3 months of his life to do that. And I think most people would agree he did a remarkable job. I think that experience reflects more accurately on Mr. Fisher's reputation than the wild speculation that has been reported about him in some aspects of the press in connection with his contacts with Mr. Channel. So I wanted to clear that up because I think that Dave served long and well down there, and basically I think you had nothing but the highest opinion of him, if I don't.
That's absolutely correct. I always thought he was a great guy, and he was tireless in his devotion to the President, and the amount of time that he spent, weekends, nights, days, and so forth, accompanying the President, no matter where the President went. He went way beyond the normal call of duty.
And he's a good family man. He's a young man with a family.
I understand.
Well, I appreciate you clearing that up, and I wanted to clear it up because I think sometimes, some of our elements of the press jump on things and misconstrue them and misstate them, and sometimes just tell downright untruths. And this particular matter has been filled with good reporting and bad reporting, but I've seen a lot of bad reporting on it. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it and appreciate your testimony.
Thanks, sir.
Mr. Jenkins for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary.
Good morning, Mr. Jenkins.
I only have three questions to clear up. It appears to me from listening to all of the witnesses, including yourself, that the overriding concern really of the White House during this entire operation up to and until the diversion was discovered was to put the best light on the situation to prevent the perception from being that it was an exchange of arms for hostages. Would you generally agree with
Well, the story
concern?
wasn't, yes, the story wasn't known until about November 4th or 5th. And in the period between November 5th and November 24th, you're correct.
It appears to me from the various witnesses and the documents that everyone was concerned about making sure that as this story is released, we place the President in the position that he's not exchanging arms for hostages. Now, am I correct?
You are correct, but you've got to remember with a slight addition to what you just said, because the reason we wanted to do that was because that was what the President actually wanted.
I understand that.
The opening of the contact with Iran was his number one problem.
I understand that from your testimony yesterday, although you also indicated that obviously it developed into an exchange of arms for hostages, in fact.
That is correct. By October of '86, it had dwindled into that.
Yes, sir. Did you ever talk with the Admiral about, since you've learned about the destruction of the December finding, was that the reason for the tearing up of that document?
I have not talked to Admiral Poindexter since November 25th.
Well, as you know, Colonel North has indicated that he was scheduled to be the fall guy. And when Admiral Poindexter did not speak up in behalf of Colonel North, but when this was discovered, at the time he talked with you, at the time he talked with the President, the impression that he gave was that he didn't really know anything about this except in general terms, and that the operation was in fact one operated by Colonel North more or less alone. Is that the impression he gave all of you?
Well, I wouldn't say alone, but the impression was given that somebody else was doing this, and North was responsible. He should have looked into it a little bit more, but didn't.
But the Admiral didn't speak up for Colonel North at that time at all?
No, I don't believe so.
He was letting him shoulder most of the responsibility?
Well, that was just the first, in the first blush of this. That was in his conversations with me on the morning of the 25th, and in the same morning with the President.
But he volunteered no support whatsoever for North at that time?
Well, except to say that he thought that whatever it was that North was doing it with the purest of motives, that he was trying to help the countries.
And when he said that he was doing it with the purest of motives, of course, all at the same time, as he has testified here, he was calling the shots, apparently, for North.
Well, as I say, that I learned from this committee, the testimony before this committee, and was quite surprised when I read it.
Yes, sir. Let me ask you one thing that has always concerned me with, as I know it has you. You've already indicated the agreement that was entered into by Mr. Hakim on behalf of the United States and Iran. Admiral Poindexter testified that he took this agreement in to the President to get his approval, and later relayed that approval back to the people in Iran. Now, the 9 points of the agreement, some of which were carried out, as a matter of fact, later, and the translation of item 3, which says, and this is the item that concerned you, and you indicated concerned the President later. Before executing item 4 below, Albert Hakim will provide the plan for the release of the Kuwaitis, the 17 people. You indicated that when the President first learned of this, he was shocked. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So your interpretation is that if the Admiral mentioned this to him, he must have...
I don't know when the Admiral actually did mention this to the President. I cannot envisage the President, as adamant as he was about not wanting to do anything to secure the release of any of those Dawa prisoners, that he would have agreed to this. And I'm sure that the President would never have agreed to having one Albert Hakim, unknown to him, out making agreements with the government of Iran.
So if, in fact, Admiral Poindexter showed these 9 points to the President back in May of '86, he must have skipped over this or...
Well, it certainly would not have been presented in the way that you just presented it. Definitely not.
He would not have read it out like I read it out from from the agreement.
That's correct.
I mean, I wanted to make sure that you understand I was not placing
I
it in my
understand
language. I was reading Mr. Hakim's agreement.
I understand.
Yes.
I find that
One other
hard
question.
to believe.
I'm sorry.
I said I find that hard to believe, Hakim's testimony on that.
Well, I think that the Admiral also testified that he did get the approval of the President on this, but you would find that hard to believe also, would you not?
Yes.
One other area. There's been a lot of discussion about what we can do to try to shore up some of the obvious problems between the executive branch and the legislative branch with leaks, and to make sure that we do not repeat the mistakes that have been made here in the future. But I keep trying to reconcile in my mind, it would make no difference whether or not we have 30 members of a joint intelligence committee or 2 members that are notified if, in fact, the National Security Advisor does not even share the information with the President. We would never know about that anyway, would we?
No. But I have to think that that's an aberration. That would not be normal practice. I have to think that if there were a small group from this Congress who were discussing covert actions and were by law or by practice to be the ones to be told about covert operations, that information would deliberately be withheld from them. I don't think that would happen.
I agree with you, and I agree with you on the limitation that should be made as far as the legislative branch, as far as the number of people. But the problem I was trying to get to, how do we make sure that a national security advisor or whomever tells the President?
The only answer is a very simple one. Pick the right people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, I want to focus very quickly in the beginning on the December 7th meeting of '85, when both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense were very much against moving forward with any further measures with respect to developing this opening to Iran, and you were opposed as well, as I understand it.
That is correct.
The upshot of that meeting, though, was to send McFarland to London at least to make one final exploration. Is that correct?
As I understood it, as I recall it, it was to sort of wind it down.
And McFarland came back and reported that this thing was just out of the question. These were very sleazy characters, and we ought not to have anything at all to do with them. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, in a matter of only a few weeks, the whole thing became alive again. And in fact, you joined in the effort to resuscitate it, I gather, on the basis of the persuasive case made to you by Admiral Poindexter. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did you know at the time that there was the I assume you didn't from your testimony, since you didn't know about the diversion, but you didn't have any inkling at the time that there was the possibility that the Iranian arms sales might provide monies for the Contra operation and indeed for other operations as it was subsequently used?
I had no idea of that.
Looking back on it now, do you have any sense that some of the motive force, the driving force to put it back into place may have come from those, Poindexter, North, others, who saw in it an opportunity to create a fund that would be available to be used for other covert actions and in Nicaragua and elsewhere?
I'm not sure that the extent of the knowledge or how much planning had been done about diversion at the time that we discussed this on January 7th in the NSPG. I haven't examined the record, complete record before this committee, but I find it difficult to believe that between, let's say, December 10th or so, whenever it was McFarland got back, and January 7th, that the diversion scheme was concocted. I think that may have come a little later, or grown. It may have been in somebody's mind, but it grew after that rather than before that. There was certainly no discussion of that at the January 7th meeting.
Now, let me ask you about your role as Chief of Staff and the relationship with the National Security Advisor. You spoke yesterday about that you weren't a supervisor because, and you've re-emphasized that point this morning, saying there were two staffs in effect, and you said that your relationship was more of sharing or of liaison. But my sense of it is you didn't even have that. You, in effect, were frozen out here by Admiral Poindexter. First of all, you said yesterday about the paper flow. No, I tried to find out if there are any such papers because occasionally something would happen and somebody would say from the National Security Council would say to the President, well, you remember we showed that to you, or you remember you got that in your book. And I would say, hey, I didn't get that in my book. What happened? And they would say, we just gave that to the President. Now, this doesn't affect the access of the National Security Advisor to the President or the two staffs, but on a sharing basis, if that was to be the relationship, should not you as the Chief of Staff have known of the papers that were going to the President on which he was signing off?
Well, again, this is a controversial item. Just how much should the Chief of Staff be told of about sensitive information regarding other governments, things of that nature, that type of intelligence? I have discussed this with other Chiefs of Staff. Some of them told me that when they were there, they didn't want to know what was going on in the foreign area. I found out, though, that Jim Baker, as well as Ed Meese, had attended meetings of all meetings of the National Security Council when they were in office in the White House. I felt that I should attend meetings, that I should keep myself briefed on it, because not only did it enable me to carry on a better conversation or give better advice to the President, but it also, from scheduling points of view, I had to know what they were contemplating as far as possible presidential movements. Was he going to meet with somebody? Would he be going abroad? Something of that nature. So I tried to stay into that. Well, that became a little bit of a turf battle that I was considered a little bit pushy for wanting this type of information. And there were attempts made, successfully apparently, to keep things from me.
Well, I'm frank to say to you, I don't see how you could do your job without this information. Let me give you just a couple of examples. You said that when Poindexter was preparing the president for the press conference in the family theater, that there were others in the room who didn't know about it. In other words, that he spoke in a circuitous fashion, since he didn't want to reveal this information to other people, I take it.
That's correct.
And you said, I think this sort of confused the presidential mind as to what he could say and couldn't say, and what he should say and what he shouldn't say. Now, it's interesting because North sent Poindexter a prof note which talked about the same problem, where the thing had become so compartmentalized that even North recognized it. And this was about having someone talk to Schultz about what third country assistant approaches had been made. I mean, here's the Secretary of State who deals with these countries. Approaches were being made to them by others in the administration, and the Secretary of State didn't know about it. Now, it seems to me that places him in an incredibly awkward position in dealing with these countries. And finally, he says, meanwhile, this is North to Poindexter, meanwhile, I would recommend that you and McFarland have a talk about how much Secretary Schultz does or does not know about third country assistance approaches, so that we don't make any mistakes. At this point, I'm not sure who on our side knows what. Help. Now, did you have a sense as you participated in some of these meetings that the meetings could not really function because the people involved didn't know the subject matter, matters were being withheld or concealed from them? The same sense you had at the Poindexter briefing for the press conference in November of 1986?
Well, I think I alluded to this earlier. There are times when you get into the foreign policy area or actions involving the collection or dissemination of information where few people understand exactly or completely what is going on. It's very difficult to brief the president with that happening. For example, and I don't wish to denigrate these people in my saying this, but we would have, as interrogators or questioners of the president, three people, perhaps some of them from the press office staff. They obviously didn't know all of the details. They were deliberately selected that way because, like members of the press, they didn't have all of the details. But they would be asking this the question. We wanted to see how far the president could go in his answers. And quite obviously, if he were incorrect, he would be corrected right there. But later, and I'm not here referring to the November 19th press conference, but to many other press conferences, you would say to the president before he goes into the press conference, you could say only this much. Remember, say only this much about that subject and no more, because we don't want to give away too much information. Is that type of thing. The president always has that when he gets into a press conference.
I understand that, but it seems to me what was at work here was greatly in excess of that.
Oh, in this case, yes, because you see, quite obviously what I was driving at is Poindexter, North, and some others had knowledge of the diversion at that point.
That's right.
And they weren't telling the president. And in an effort to keep that information from the rest of us, they were giving these convoluted answers.
Yeah, in fact, they exchanged prof notes in which North says, I have no idea what Don Regan does or does not know, re my private U.S. operation. And then Poindexter, in responding, says, Don Regan knows very little of your operation, and that is just as well. And then North went on to ask him, when McFarland was going to go to Tehran, whether there ought not to be a meeting with the Secretary of State and Defense and the Director of Central Intelligence, with the President. And Poindexter responded negatively, and he said, quote, I don't want a meeting with Ronald Reagan, Schultz, and Weinberger, the other two statutory members of the National Security Council. It seems to me what happened in all of this is, in effect, there was a junta within the government of the United States. I mean, you had Poindexter and North and their associates in effect invoking the authority of the President of the United States, freezing out the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State, and pursuing their own policy. Policies which the President says if he'd known about them, he would have strongly opposed, and policies which you say that when you learned about them, you reacted with shock and horror. And the real question is, what can we do to minimize the chances that this will occur? Now, you've said, well, you have to get good people. But then everyone says, well, these were good people, but this was an aberration. But nevertheless, we're left with this situation in which, in effect, the policy of the government had in a sense been taken over. A coup, in effect, had occurred in the White House. And of course, the Chief of Staff was left there with this having happened under and around him, and according to your testimony, which I'm prepared to accept, unaware that it was taking place.
Well, I think in the future, if you have legal counsel guiding any covert operation as a matter of policy that this must do, and if there are to be funds involved, that there be a full accounting for these funds on a regular basis. And if you insist that the NSC not be an operating unit, that whenever there is to be a covert operation, it be run by the CIA or whoever, but not the NSC, and done in accordance with proper procedures, I think you could avoid this type of happening in the future. It will hobble the NSC to a certain extent, but I think there's a difference between foreign operations and foreign policy. Many people have said to me, well, if you do that, how could you in the future have a Kissinger go to China to open a door? That's a big difference between that and a covert operation. I think that the President could use his foreign policy advisor as a messenger, as a scout, or for whatever purpose he wanted. But at the same time, he would not be using an entire military staff in the field conducting operations. I don't think there's a need for that. That's why we have a CIA or a Department of Defense or a Department of State.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Senator Heflin for 5 minutes.
Mr. Regan, I had several questions. Many of them have been asked when I first started. I would like to make a comment. I think that you have been right forthright, and it's been interesting to me that as you testified, I don't believe that you have at any time, at least I did not hear it, use the words, "I don't remember." You haven't used any words such as that might have occurred but I don't recall it, or that my memory is not too good on the details of that incident. Frankly, I have been impressed that some of the witnesses that appeared before this committee have had a convenient loss of memory. I think you've impressed the vast majority of the members of the committee with your forthrightness and candor. And in my judgment, your testimony and appearance here has removed the image that you were the fall guy, regardless of the origin of that term, or that you are the spear catcher or the goat. And while realizing that the Tower Commission moved in a rapid period of time to make its report, did not have many of the witnesses that have appeared before these committees, and did not have a great deal of the documentary evidence that we have. Nevertheless, in my judgment, I feel that the Tower Commission in its report did you a disservice. I do have one question that I wanted to ask of you, and I don't think it has been brought out. That is, do you have any knowledge which would indicate that the Vice President knew or did not know of the diversion of the funds from the sale of the arms to Iran to the Contras.
From all I gathered from his remarks on and after November 25th, he had no knowledge of the diversion of funds.
That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Senator Cohen for his 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure after Senator Sarbanes' observation whether I should address you as Commandante Regan at this point.
Well, I don't think he assumed I was part of the junta.
Now that you were the victim of it, apparently. You spoke briefly to Congressman Stokes about a presidential pardon, a discussion of that, and I think you indicated the President said that would be assuming guilt before they're even accused and rejected it out of hand. Was there also a strategy session to seek congressional immunity as early as December of 1985 for the witnesses?
Yes, there was.
Wouldn't that have been tantamount to a congressional pardon in advance?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, again, and I don't want to say as to what the legal position would have been regarding that. I'd have to pass on that one.
When was the first time you learned that Mr. Khashoggi was involved in the Iranian arms sales transactions?
Not until, I think it was the Tower report.
You didn't learn about it until then?
That's right.
Had you heard his name, would the same reaction have been set off as Tiny Roland set off in your mind?
Oh, yes.
As a matter of fact, you had, when you were at Merrill Lynch, dealings with Mr. Khashoggi?
My firm did, yes.
I think I've asked you this before. Is it fair to say that Merrill Lynch is still bullish on Mr. Khashoggi?
You'll have to ask Merrill Lynch.
All right. One final point. Senator McClure raised the issue of the Israeli role in this entire affair, and I think based upon your testimony, it is that we were dragged into this fiasco by the Israelis. The President was angry. He told Mr. McFarland to express his displeasure privately to the Israelis. Mr. McFarland has testified on several occasions before the intelligence committees of both houses and also before this committee that the President's reaction was just the opposite. Not only was he given authority, but the President was pleased with the success of the operation that culminated, at least initially, with the release of Mr. Benjamin Weir. And so the question I have for you, wouldn't the President's own notes help to resolve the direct conflict between Mr. McFarland and your own recollection of the events?
I don't know. I know that the President told me that he had searched his notes, and whatever he had turned over to the Tower Commission, so...
But they would be helpful in any event in reconciling this apparent disparity.
I'm not sure that he took notes of this. Recall...
If he did, would they be helpful?
They might be.
Okay.
He was in the hospital at the first meeting and had just come home from the hospital at the second meeting.
But in any event, if we were angry in September with the Israelis, we were on board by November in 1985 with the acquiescence or authorization of the sale of the Hawks. And by December 7th, we were signing retroactive findings. And by January 6th of 1986, unbeknownst to you, we were so enthusiastic that we cut out the Israelis and cut in Mr. Hakim and General Secord. Is that right?
That's right.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Committee Counsel Thomas McGough for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, I wanted to follow up, if I could, on a recommendation that you made to Congressman DeWine and you alluded to, I believe, in an answer to Senator Boren and also perhaps to Senator Sarbanes, and that is that White House counsel be involved in decisions on covert actions. As I'm sure you know, there are some who would suggest that the only thing that could be worse than having 2 attorneys involved in a decision would be having 3 attorneys involved in a decision. And under one view of the testimony we've received, there weren't too few attorneys involved, but too many, no one of whom bore ultimate responsibility for identifying and resolving legal problems. Could you take your recommendation one step further and, assuming the White House counsel is involved in the process, tell us how the how the President should structure the decision-making process to ensure that at least one person in the process is ultimately responsible for identifying those legal problems and bringing them forward and, if possible, resolving them?
Well, I haven't thought this through to the extent that I have dotted every I and crossed every T. But as far as having another lawyer in the thing, I have found from my Wall Street experience that if the other guys have got lawyers, you ought better have one too. The President, I think, has to rely on his own counsel for advice as to whether this is a legal matter or not. He has the Attorney General, I grant you. But he wants to have, what I'm suggesting here is an enhanced role for the President's counsel in which he would be following up on the intimate details of this. I don't think you could expect the Attorney General, who's administering a rather large department, to be intimately following a particular covert operation from start to finish. But I am suggesting that the White House counsel should be one of the ones involved in this. He could at least hopefully spot any attempt by others to get off the baseline and put them back on. He could make certain that if Congress were going to be notified within a particular period, that the Congress was notified, and to the extent that the Congress was notified. In other words, you'd have a watchdog from a legal point of view. To expect the National Security Council lawyer to do this, I think is asking a little bit much also, in the event that the National Security Council again, or its National Security Advisor, was going to do something wrong deliberately. How can the President protect himself is the question that was asked. And that's where my suggestion comes, that he should make certain that his own counsel is involved.
Well, the question is, in one sense, how can the President protect himself? But in another sense, how can one person in that process, or shouldn't one person in that process be identified as the person who has ultimate responsibility for flagging these legal issues? In the January 1986 period, which is a very critical time in this initiative, you had, at least under one view of the testimony, Judge Sporkin deferring to Attorney General Meese on the legality of the activity, and Attorney General Meese essentially deferring to Judge Sporkin, and both of them to one extent or another relying on a prior opinion by Attorney General William French Smith in a different context. And no one in that situation may have been ultimately responsible for stepping forward and saying this is a legal issue that we have to confront. Do you see any way to resolve that?
I think there is a way to resolve it. I think it is an issue that if this committee doesn't choose to solve it, at least they should raise it as an issue and suggest to the executive branch that it should solve it and come back with an answer.
Thank you, Mr. Regan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McGough. We have 2 minutes remaining. The chair recognizes Senator Sarbanes for the 2 minutes.
Mr. Regan, there was one question I didn't get to put to you. Director Casey had an office in the White House complex. He's the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency where that is the case. Secretary Shultz suggested that at least the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense ought to have offices in the White House complex. My question to you is, should the CIA director have an office in the White House complex? And then would you go on to address the other question as to whether the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, who have the national security responsibility, should have offices in the White House complex?
Senator, let me be a little bit jocular here. If everybody who wanted a desk in the White House or an office in the White House got it, we'd have a 10-story office building right next to the White House, completely filled. There are many cabinet officers who think that they are divorced from the White House because they're not there every day. They sort of feel they're on outpost duty if they're 3 blocks away. I know this from experience of having lived and worked across the street from the White House in Treasury. When Secretary Shultz was Secretary of the Treasury, he had an office in the White House as an advisor to the President. I think he's basing some of his suggestion on that. from my point of view, I think each of them should keep his own office and stay out of the White House. And I think things would flow just as smoothly with proper liaison. I don't think the geographical location of the person is important, as is the person's ideas and the person's thoughts being given to the president. And as long as he gets to see the president or gets into the process of helping to shape policy, his own location, I think, is immaterial.
Well, now, do you extend that to the Director of Central Intelligence?
Certainly.
That he should not have been in the White House?
I know of no other Director of Central Intelligence who had an office in the West Wing or in the EOB.
Chair recognizes Mr. Stokes and yields him 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, a few moments ago, Senator Coyne followed up on a question I had posed to you earlier this morning about pardon and congressional immunity. And you've indicated to him there was a strategy around the question of congressional immunity. Is that correct?
I said that one of the strategies proposed in order to get this story out sooner was the question of congressional immunity, yes.
All right. And can you tell us a little more about the strategy? Was the strategy that members of Congress ought to be contacted with reference to their pursuing the granting of congressional immunity?
As a matter of fact, Mr. Stokes, I believe that was done, that certain congressional leaders were contacted to see what the mood of the Congress might be regarding that.
Let's see. Now, was that done with any view in mind that the pursuit of congressional immunity might have some type of effect upon both Colonel North and Poindexter in terms of their attitudes?
I think the attitude was exactly what happened later, or what we believed would happen did happen. Once these two men did get a grant of immunity, they did testify before the Congress in this committee. We thought they might do the same thing had the Senate Intelligence or the House Intelligence Committee granted that same immunity.
Let's see. It was felt they probably would not testify then, say, before these congressional committees without being given this kind of immunity.
That was our understanding at the time, yes.
Let's see. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Regan, we have come to the end of the day as far as your testimony is concerned. And in behalf of the committee, I thank you very much for assisting us in our investigation. Do you have any closing statement you wish to make? Most witnesses have taken advantage of that.
No, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll spare you any more diatribes from Regan. I think that I do want to thank you and your co-chairman for your courtesies to me, particularly in view of my throat. It was certainly nice of you to give me a reprieve last night. I also want to take this occasion, although he didn't appear at the table beside me, to thank the attorney who helped prepare me, Mr. John Mintz, who is here behind me. Some people asked who the heck he was sitting there. A very competent former general counsel of the FBI. And then the only other thing I can say in conclusion, I want to thank the rest of the members of this committee for being so courteous, and I hope it doesn't get them into trouble that they get to be known as regular fellows from the fact they can smile occasionally. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Chairman Hamilton.
Mr. Secretary, the council wanted me to check with you. You've been very cooperative in making available to us your records. They did want to know if you had turned over to the committee all of your White House notes. Have you done that, to your knowledge?
As far, to my knowledge, yes.
All right. Well, we appreciate that very much. Let me simply join with the others in expressing appreciation for your testimony. I think you can tell by the reaction of the committee members that all of us are deeply appreciative for it. You've had a most distinguished record of service to the government and to the people, and we wish you and your family all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Our next witness will be the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Caspar Weinberger. We will now stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair.